The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Ethan Blackwood's broad shoulders as he guided his stallion through the rugged canyon pass. 3 years had passed since he'd lost everything in the war: his family farm in Virginia, his younger brother to a Confederate bullet, and whatever remained of his faith in humanity. Now at 32, he worked his small cattle ranch alone, speaking more to his horses than to the townsfolk of Redemption Creek. The drought of 1876 had been unforgiving. Ethan had ridden out to check on the western water source, finding it reduced to little more than mud. As he turned back toward home, something caught his eye: a splash of faded blue fabric against the red dust, half hidden behind a boulder. Dismounting cautiously, hand resting on his revolver, he approached. What he found made his weathered face harden. A woman lay crumpled in the dirt, her simple dress torn and bloodied, dark hair matted with dust. Her face was bruised, lips cracked from dehydration. At first glance, he thought she was dead. "Ma'am?" His voice, unused to speaking, came out as a rough whisper. When her eyelids fluttered weakly, revealing unfocused hazel eyes, Ethan acted quickly. He knelt beside her, noting the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Rope burns marked her wrists, and a trail of blood had dried along her temple. Someone had beaten her, tied her up, and left her to die in the unforgiving desert. "Can you hear me?" he asked, unscrewing his canteen. She tried to speak, but only managed a pained whimper. Gently cradling her head, he tipped a small amount of water to her parched lips. She coughed, then drank greedily. "Easy now," he murmured. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert wind. "Sarah Miller. Who did this to you?" Fear flashed across her face. "Please," she begged, clutching weakly at his arm. "Don't take me back to town. They'll kill me." Before he could question her further, her eyes rolled back and she slipped into unconsciousness. Ethan surveyed the empty landscape, weighing his options. The nearest doctor was in Redemption Creek, a half-day's ride away, but if someone there wanted her dead— With the decision made, he carefully lifted her onto his horse. Her body felt too light, too fragile against his chest as he mounted behind her. "Get on the horse," he whispered, more to himself than to her unconscious form. "Just hold on." The sun was setting by the time his modest ranch house came into view, a sturdy 2-room cabin with a small barn and corral. Inside, he laid Sarah on his bed, noting with concern how the fever had taken hold during their journey. Working methodically, he cleaned her wounds with water and whiskey, discovering more bruises beneath her tattered clothing. Nothing appeared broken, but she'd been beaten severely. Through the night he sat beside her, replacing cool cloths on her forehead as she mumbled deliriously. In her fever dreams, she pleaded with unseen assailants, called out for her father, and occasionally grew so terrified that Ethan had to hold her hands to prevent her from hurting herself. At dawn, her fever broke. When she finally opened her eyes with clarity, she recoiled in fear. "You're safe," Ethan said, keeping his distance. "My name's Ethan Blackwood. Found you in the canyon yesterday. This is my ranch." Sarah struggled to sit up, wincing in pain. "How long have I been here?" "Just the night. You were pretty bad off." He poured her a cup of water. "Whoever did this to you—" "I can't stay," she interrupted, voice trembling. "If they find me here, they'll kill you too." "Who's they, Miss Miller?" Her hands shook as she accepted the water. "Marshal Whitfield and his men. They run Redemption Creek now." Tears welled in her eyes. "My father owned the general store. When he refused to pay their protection fee, they burned it down with him inside. I saw everything. When I threatened to ride to the territorial capital for help, Whitfield—" Her voice broke. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd had limited dealings with the town's new marshal, but the man's reputation for corruption had spread throughout the territory. "You need rest before you go anywhere," he said firmly. "You're safe here for now." "No place is safe," Sarah whispered, but exhaustion overtook her and she sank back against the pillows. As she drifted into sleep, Ethan moved to the window, staring out at the vast, empty landscape surrounding his isolated ranch. For 3 years, he'd kept to himself, wanting nothing to do with other people's troubles, but the woman in his bed had stirred something he thought long dead, a sense of duty, of righteous anger. In the distance, a dust cloud rose on the horizon. Riders were coming. 3 riders approached Ethan's property, their silhouettes distorted by the midday heat. Through his rifle scope, he recognized Whitfield's deputy, Lucas Cole, flanked by two of the marshal's hired guns. Ethan had avoided trouble with them thus far, but harboring a fugitive, even an innocent one, would change that quickly. He glanced back at Sarah, who was struggling to stand despite her injuries. "They're coming," she whispered, terror etching lines into her young face. "Get back in bed," Ethan ordered, "and stay quiet." When the men dismounted at his fence line, Ethan stepped onto the porch, shotgun held casually at his side, not threatening, but present. "Afternoon, Blackwood," Cole called out, adjusting his badge-adorned vest. "Been a while since you've come to town." "Nothing in town I need," Ethan replied evenly. "We're looking for a fugitive," Cole continued. "Young woman, dark hair, killed her own father and tried to frame the marshal. Dangerous and unstable." Ethan's expression remained impassive. "Haven't seen anyone out here in weeks. Just me and the cattle." Cole's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Mind if we take a look around? Won't take but a minute." "Actually, I do mind," Ethan said, shifting his shotgun slightly. "My land starts at that fence line. Unless you've got a warrant, I suggest you turn around." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before Cole spat in the dust. "Marshal Whitfield won't take kindly to obstruction, Blackwood." "Not obstructing anything, just protecting my privacy." After another moment, Cole signaled to his men. "We'll be back," he warned before they mounted their horses and rode away. Inside, Ethan found Sarah clutching a kitchen knife, her knuckles white. "They'll return with more men," she said, lowering the blade. "I should go." "And do what? Die in the desert again?" Ethan took the knife gently from her grasp. "They'll be watching the trails now." "I can't stay here," she insisted. "I've brought enough trouble to your door." Ethan paced the small cabin, thinking. "There's another option," he said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Something that might keep you safe and give us time to prove Whitfield's crimes." Sarah looked at him questioningly. "Marriage," he stated bluntly. "If you're my wife, it complicates things legally, makes it harder for them to just take you." Her eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "It would be in name only," he clarified, uncomfortable with his own suggestion. "But as Mrs. Blackwood, you'd have more protection than as Sarah Miller, fugitive." "You'd do that for a stranger?" Disbelief colored her voice. Ethan looked away. "I've seen enough good people buried because no one stood up when it mattered." The silence between them grew heavy with the weight of his proposal. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it's just on paper, just for protection, nothing more," Ethan confirmed. The next morning, they rode to the neighboring town of Silver Springs, where the circuit preacher didn't know their faces. Sarah wore Ethan's mother's faded dress, found in an old trunk. The simple ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes, with the shopkeeper and his wife as witnesses. When the preacher instructed Ethan to kiss his bride, they shared an awkward, brief touch of lips. "Mrs. Blackwood," the preacher announced cheerfully, unaware of the circumstances that had brought them together. On the ride home, they maintained a careful distance, both processing the significance of what they'd done. Ethan had sworn never to marry after losing his fiancée to consumption before the war. Sarah had dreamed of a love match, not a desperate arrangement with a stoic stranger. As they approached the ranch, Ethan spotted fresh hoof prints leading to his cabin. "Stay back," he warned, drawing his revolver. They circled wide, approaching from behind the barn. Through the cabin window, they could see Marshal Whitfield himself, rifling through Ethan's belongings, 2 men standing guard outside. "He's looking for evidence of me," Sarah whispered. "He's about to find something else entirely," Ethan replied, pulling their marriage certificate from his saddlebag. "Follow my lead." They rode openly toward the cabin, Sarah seated behind Ethan, her arms tentatively around his waist for stability. At their approach, Whitfield and his men emerged, hands hovering near their weapons. "Blackwood," Whitfield called, his thick mustache twitching with disdain. "Interesting company you're keeping." "Marshal," Ethan acknowledged coolly, helping Sarah down from the horse. "I see you've made yourself at home on my property." Whitfield's cold eyes fixed on Sarah. "You're harboring a murderess, Blackwood. That makes you an accessory." "Can't harbor my own wife," Ethan countered, handing the certificate to one of the deputies. "We were just returning from our wedding in Silver Springs." The marshal's face contorted with fury as he snatched the document. "This changes nothing. She's still wanted for murder." "She's wanted for witnessing your crimes," Ethan corrected, "and now she's under my protection. You want her? You'll need to convince a territorial judge, and I reckon Mrs. Blackwood will have quite a story to tell him." Whitfield stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You've made a grave mistake, Blackwood. No one defies me in my territory. This isn't your territory, Ethan replied steadily, and she's not your victim anymore. When the marshal and his men finally departed, tension crackling in their wake, Sarah collapsed onto the porch steps, trembling uncontrollably. He'll be back, she said, staring at the dust cloud left by their horses. With more men. Ethan nodded grimly. Then we'd better be ready. That night, they sat across from each other at his small table, a gulf of uncertainty between them, despite the legal bond they now shared. Thank you, Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. For risking everything for a stranger. Ethan met her gaze. We're not strangers anymore, Mrs. Blackwood. The title hung in the air between them, foreign yet somehow right. The following weeks brought an uneasy routine to the Blackwood ranch. By day, Ethan taught Sarah to shoot his spare revolver while they fortified the cabin against the attack they knew would eventually come. By night, they shared stilted conversations across the supper table, slowly piecing together each other's broken histories. Ethan learned that Sarah had been engaged to the son of a wealthy cattle baron before her father's murder, but her fiancé had abandoned her when she accused Whitfield. Sarah discovered that Ethan had fought for the Union despite his Virginia roots, returning from war to find his family land seized and his community unwelcoming. They slept in separate spaces, Ethan on a bedroll by the hearth, Sarah in his bed, maintaining the boundaries of their arrangement. Yet something was shifting between them, a cautious trust building in small moments, her hand steadying his as he showed her how to clean a rifle, his gentle fingers rebandaging a wound on her arm, shared laughter over a burned supper. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, Sarah broke a comfortable silence. I never thanked you properly, she said, for finding me that day. Ethan shook his head. Don't need thanks for basic decency. It wasn't just decency, she insisted. Most men would have left me there or turned me in. You gave me your name, your protection. She hesitated. I know our marriage isn't real, but it's real enough on paper, he interrupted, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Sarah studied him thoughtfully. You don't talk about your life before Arizona. Not much to tell. He stared into the distance. I don't believe that, she said softly. A man doesn't become as closed off as you without reason. The silence stretched between them until, surprisingly, Ethan spoke. Had a wife once, before the war. The admission seemed to cost him something. Caroline. Fever took her and our unborn child while I was fighting at Gettysburg. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to cover his. I'm sorry. Been a long time, he said, though his voice betrayed otherwise. Is that why you live so far from town, from people? Ethan considered this. Partly. Mostly I got tired of fighting. Thought I could find peace out here alone. And have you? Found peace? He looked at her then, really looked at her, noticing how the sunset caught the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. Not exactly. The moment stretched between them, something unspoken passing in the evening air. Then, abruptly, Ethan stood. Should check the fences before dark. 3 days later, disaster struck. Ethan returned from checking cattle to find the barn ablaze, flames licking at the dry timber. Sarah was nowhere in sight. Panic seized him as he raced toward the cabin, calling her name. He found her inside, bleeding from a head wound, struggling to stand. Whitfield's men, she gasped as he helped her to her feet. They said it was a warning. Next time, it'll be the cabin, and us inside it. Something primal and protective surged through Ethan as he examined her injury. Pack what you can, he instructed. We're leaving. To go where? She asked, wincing as he cleaned the wound. My friend Jacob runs a trading post near the Navajo territory. We'll be safe there until we figure out our next move. They rode through the night, Sarah leaning weakly against Ethan's chest, his arms encircling her protectively as he guided the horse through familiar back trails. By dawn, they reached Jacob's trading post, a sturdy structure nestled against red rock cliffs. Jacob Two Hawks, half Navajo and half Irish, had fought alongside Ethan during the war. He welcomed them without question, offering his small back room and sending his son to watch for pursuers. As Sarah rested, Ethan and Jacob spoke in low voices by the fireplace. Whitfield's got the county judge in his pocket, Jacob warned, and half the territorial officials. You need more than just her testimony. I know, Ethan replied grimly, but we've got nothing else. Jacob studied his friend thoughtfully. She's not just a cause to you anymore, is she? Ethan's jaw tightened. She's my wife. On paper, maybe. But I see how you look at her. Jacob leaned forward. You were dead inside when you came to Arizona, brother. Now there's life in your eyes again. Before Ethan could respond, Jacob's son burst through the door. Riders coming, 6 men armed. Jacob quickly handed Ethan a loaded rifle. Take her out the back way, there's a cave in the cliffs. You remember it? Ethan nodded, already moving toward the back room where Sarah slept. He woke her gently, explaining the situation in hurried whispers. I'm tired of running, she said, eyes fierce despite her exhaustion. Tired of other people fighting my battles. This is our battle now, Ethan replied, helping her to her feet. They slipped out the back door as the riders approached the trading post. In the growing light, Ethan recognized not only Whitfield and his men, but also Judge Clayton from Redemption Creek, the very official they would need to convince of Whitfield's corruption. Wait, Sarah whispered, pulling Ethan back as they reached the cover of a large boulder. The judge is with them. If Whitfield kills us now, he'll have a witness he can't control, Ethan finished, understanding her thinking. They exchanged a look, years of collective hardship reflected in both their eyes. Without words, they made a decision, not to flee, but to stand. Slowly, they walked back toward the trading post, weapons holstered, hands visible. Marshal Whitfield, Ethan called out as they approached, I believe you're trespassing on Navajo land. All guns turned toward them, but Whitfield held up a hand, stopping his men from firing, his cold eyes fixed on Sarah. Judge Clayton, Sarah addressed the older man directly. I'm Sarah Miller, Sarah Blackwood now. I witnessed Marshal Whitfield murder my father and burn our store to the ground. I'm prepared to testify to that effect. The judge looked between Sarah and Whitfield, uncertainty crossing his weathered face. She's delusional, Whitfield snarled. Killed her own father and blamed me. Ask anyone in town. Ask anyone who isn't on your payroll, Ethan countered, stepping protectively closer to Sarah. Or perhaps ask why the marshal of a small town travels with armed men instead of proper deputies. Judge Clayton cleared his throat. Serious accusations require evidence, Mrs. Blackwood. I have evidence. Jacob's voice came from the doorway of the trading post. He held up a leather-bound ledger. Whitfield's been demanding protection money from every business from here to Redemption Creek. I've been keeping records. For the first time, uncertainty flashed across Whitfield's face. There's more, Sarah added. The deed to my father's store. After the fire, Whitfield claimed my father sold it to him before his accident, but I have the original deed, with my name as inheritor in case of my father's death. She reached slowly into her pocket and withdrew a folded singed document. The judge took it, examining it carefully. This appears to be an order, Marshal. How do you explain? Whitfield's response was to draw his gun, aiming not at Sarah or Ethan, but at the judge himself. Enough of this farce. Everything happened at once. Jacob shouted a warning. Ethan lunged for Sarah, knocking her to the ground as gunfire erupted. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Whitfield's men lay motionless in the dirt. The marshal himself was clutching a bleeding arm, his gun kicked away by Jacob's son. The remaining men, seeing their leader wounded and the odds turning, quickly surrendered. Judge Clayton, shaken but unharmed, stared at Whitfield with new understanding. I believe I've heard enough, Marshal. You're under arrest for attempted murder. Of myself, if nothing else. As Jacob and his son helped secure the prisoners, Ethan turned to Sarah, checking her for injuries. She was dusty but unharmed, her eyes wide with the realization that it was over, truly over. You're safe now, he told her, helping her to her feet. It's done. To his surprise, tears filled her eyes. What happens now? She asked, and Ethan understood she wasn't asking about Whitfield's fate. She was asking about them. 2 weeks after Whitfield's arrest, Ethan and Sarah stood in the charred remains of the Blackwood Ranch. The barn was a total loss, and the cabin had suffered damage from a second attack after they'd fled. Yet the structure remained sound, much like the 2 people surveying it. We could rebuild, Sarah said tentatively, watching Ethan's face for his reaction. If you wanted to. Since Whitfield's capture, they had stayed in separate rooms at Jacob's trading post, their legal bond unaddressed. The marshal and his men awaited trial in the territorial capital, with both Sarah and Jacob set to testify. Judge Clayton, shaken by his brush with corruption, had promised justice would be served. But the question of their marriage hung between them like an unspoken promise, or perhaps a burden. Ethan surveyed the damaged property, his expression unreadable. Might be easier to start fresh somewhere else. Sarah's heart sank. Oh, noticing her disappointment, He clarified quickly, unless you wanted to stay. Rebuild here. What I want, she hesitated, gathering courage. What I want depends on what you want, Ethan. He turned to face her fully, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dusty yard. Our arrangement served its purpose, he said carefully. Whitfield's finished. You're safe now. You could go anywhere. Start over. Is that what you want? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For me to go? Ethan removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair in frustration. What I want doesn't matter. It matters to me, Sarah insisted, taking a step toward him. These past weeks, they weren't just about survival for me. They were about finding something I thought I'd lost forever. And what's that? Trust, she answered simply. Hope, a sense of belonging. Something vulnerable flickered across Ethan's weathered face. Sarah, I know our marriage wasn't real, she continued hurriedly. It was protection, nothing more. And if you want an annulment, I understand. But before you decide, she took a deep breath. I need you to know that somewhere between you finding me in the dust and standing up to Whitfield together, I stopped seeing our marriage as just a piece of paper. Ethan stood motionless, his expression a complex mixture of longing and fear. I'm not the man you deserve, he said finally. You should have someone whole, not broken by war and loss. Sarah closed the distance between them, placing a hand gently on his chest. We're all broken, Ethan. The question is whether we want to heal alone or together. For a long moment he simply looked at her, as if seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. Then, tentatively, he covered her hand with his own. I thought I wanted solitude, he admitted. Convinced myself I was better off alone. Then I found you in the canyon and everything changed. How? She pressed softly. You made me remember what it feels like to care about something. Someone. His voice roughened with emotion. Made me remember what it's like to have something worth fighting for. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Is that enough? To build something real between us? Instead of answering with words, Ethan lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, he kissed her. Not the perfunctory peck of their wedding ceremony, but a genuine expression of everything they'd left unspoken. When they parted, Sarah smiled tremulously. I'll take that as a yes. That evening, as the sun set over the damaged ranch, they sat together on the porch steps, planning their future. They would rebuild the barn first, Ethan decided, then repair the cabin. Sarah suggested adding a small room, perhaps for a store of her own someday, or maybe, though neither said it aloud, something else entirely. It won't be easy, Ethan warned. Ranching's hard work, especially for a woman used to town life. Sarah laughed, gesturing to her still healing wounds. After everything we've survived, you think hard work scares me? He smiled, a rare, unguarded expression that transformed his face. No, I reckon it doesn't. As darkness fell, they moved inside, the familiar awkwardness returning as they faced the sleeping arrangements. This time, however, Ethan didn't reach for his bedroll. Stay, Sarah said softly, taking his hand. Not because you found me in the dust or gave me your name, but because this is where you belong, where we belong. In the quiet darkness of the cabin, their legal bond finally became something more, a choice freely made by two people who had found in each other not just safety, but home. 6 months later, the Blackwood Ranch stood transformed. A new barn gleamed in the autumn sunlight, and the cabin had been expanded with a second room. The garden Sarah had planted was yielding its first harvest, and a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. On the porch, Ethan watched his wife hanging laundry, her movements careful around her growing belly. Their child, a son, according to the midwife from the Navajo settlement, would arrive with the winter snows. Need help? He called, setting aside the saddle he'd been mending. Sarah smiled, her face glowing with contentment. I've got it, but I wouldn't mind the company. As he joined her, taking the heavy basket from her hands despite her protests, Ethan marveled at how completely his life had changed. The solitude he'd once craved now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by something infinitely more precious. Penny for your thoughts, Sarah said, noticing his contemplative expression. Ethan glanced toward the canyon where he'd found her that fateful day, just thinking about how differently things might have turned out if I'd taken another trail home. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. I believe we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the desert in gold and crimson, Ethan wrapped his arm around his wife, feeling the gentle movement of their child beneath his hand. The past couldn't be undone, and the future held no guarantees. But in this moment, on this land, they had built something neither had thought possible again. A home, a family, a second chance. And that, Ethan realized, was more than enough.